Day 555 of doing a LeetCode problem every day until I get a job. All right, y'all, we're back again another day, another LeetCode problem where we're doing daily LeetCode problems. And today we have question number 2169, count operations to obtain 0. The difficulty level is easy, so you already know we're going to keep the solution as simple and easy to understand as well. But before we get started, y'all, don't forget to like, hype, subscribe, comment, and share. And if you need any new Apple AirPods, go ahead and check out that link in the description so you can get you some. Now let's see what the question says. You're given two non-negative integers, num1 and num2. In one operation, if num1 is greater than or equal to num2, you must subtract num2 from num1. Otherwise, subtract num1 from num2. For example, if num1 equals 5 and num2 equals 4, subtract num2 from num1, thus obtaining now num1 equals 1 and num2 now is still 4. However, if num1 equals 4 and num2 equals 5 after one operation, then num1 still equals 4 and now num2 is equal to 1. Return the number of operations required to make either num1 or required to make either num1 equals 0 or num2 equals 0. All right, y'all, so that sounds simple enough, but let's go ahead and take a look at these examples just to make sure that we are doing this problem correctly. So in example 1, we have our input num1 equals 2 and num2 equals 3. Our output is 3 because it took 3 operations to make one of these equal to 0. In this case, we were able to make num1 equal to 0, which is this. So let's go take a look at these explanations so we can see how we did that. So for the first operation, operation 1, num1 equals 2. So let me just bring this over here so I can show y'all a little better. Boom. So first we start on num1 equals 2, num2 equals 3, right? So since num2 is greater than num1, what we're going to do is if num1, it says if num1 is greater than num2, we subtract num2 from num1. So otherwise we subtract num1 from num2. So since num2 is greater than num1, we're going to subtract num1 from num2. So that's going to give us num1 is still going to be 2. Boom, because that doesn't change. And num2 now, since it's bigger, that's going to be equal to 3 minus 2, which equals 1. So now num2 is equal to 1. We get rid of this. That's just how we got the 1. Boom. Now num1 is greater than num2. So for our second operation, it says num1 equals 2 and num2 equals 1. So since now num1 is greater than 2, we're going to subtract num2 from num1. So now you can see num1 is bigger. So now we're going to subtract num2 from num1. So now num1 is equal to 2 minus 1, which equals 1. And num2 is still equal to 1. So once again, let me get rid of this. Boom. So num1 equals 1 and num2 equals 1. Boom. Then it says for operation, that was the second operation. Boom. This is the input. This is the first operation. This is the second operation. Now we're on operation 3. And num1 is equal to 1 and num2 is equal to 1. So they're both equal to 1. Since num1 is equal to num2, we subtract num2 from num1. So now num1 is equal to 0. So let me come over here. This is the next operation. So we're going to say num1 now equals 1 minus 1, which equals 0, and num2 still equal to 1. Boom. Since num1 is 0, we don't need to perform any further operations, so the total number required is 3. So boom, we can get rid of this, just num1 equals 0. So this is the input. Boom, this is let me put the code in here for y'all. Boom, that's the input. This is operation 1, colon, boom. This is operation 2, put the colon, boom. And this is operation 3. Boom. So in total, it took 3 operations to get num1 to 0. So that's why our output is 3. So just in case that didn't make sense, let's take a look at example 2. Example 2 is a little bit easier to understand because num1 starts off as equal to num2. So in example 2, we have the input num1 equals 10, num2 equals 10. We're able to make one of these equal 0 in one operation, and that one operation, since they're equal to each other, num1 equals 10, num2 equals 10. Since num1 is equal to nums2, we subtract num2 from num1, and num1 is equal to 10 minus 10, which equals 0. Now num1 is 0, num2 is 10. Since num1 is equal to 0, we are done, so the total number of operations required is 1. So since they're both equal to each other, the first operation is going to make one of these equal to 0, and in this case num1, right? It's going to make num1 equal to 0 off the first operation because we're subtracting 10 from 10, right? And that's going to equal 0 off the back first operation, so that's why the output is 1. So I hope that makes sense to y'all, and now that we understand the question, let's get into the fun part, the actual solution. Solution is not that difficult at all. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we need to check if either number is 0, then no operation can be performed, so we could just return 0. So we could use a guard statement for that to check to see if num1 or num2 is already 0. So we're going to say guard num1 does not equal 0, so exclamation point equals 0, and two and signs, num2 does not equal 0, so exclamation point equals 0. Else, if one of those do equal 0, then we could just open up the brackets and we could return 0 right away. Next, we want to check if both numbers are equal to each other and non-zero, because then that means only one operation is needed to make one of them 0, similar to example 2. So if both num1 and num2 are equal, then we already know it's going to take just one operation. So we can handle that in the guard statement as well by saying guard num1 exclamation point equals, so num1 does not equal num2, else if it does equal num2, then we could just return 1 right off the bat, just like that. Boom. Now we're going to create mutable copies of num1 and num2 so we can modify them in the loop. So we're just going to declare a variable called num1, set that equal to num1, then we're going to declare another variable called num2, and we'll set that equal to num2. Boom. Now we need a counter to keep track of how many operations are performed, right? So, or to store our result. So remember, we're counting how many operations. We need to keep count of that, so we could just declare a variable called operations count. Boom. And we'll set that equal to 0 to start our count. We're going to start our count from 0. Boom. Now, while performing the operations until one of the we'll continue performing the operations until one of the numbers becomes 0. So we'll say while num1 does not equal 0, and two and signs, num2 does not equal 0. We're going to continue these operations right here. So if num1 is greater than or equal to num2, we're subtracting num2 from num1. So we're going to say if num1 is greater than or equal to num2, just like that, that's simple. Then what we're going to do is we're going to say num1 minus equals num2. Boom. Then else, if num1 is less than or equal to num2, else, we could just put else for that. We're going to say num2 minus equals num1. Boom. Then after that, we need to increment the operation count after each subtraction. So we'll come right here, still inside the while loop, but after the if statement, we're going to say operations count plus equals 1. Boom. And then finally, all we need to do is return the total number of operations performed by coming right here outside of the while loop, and we're going to say return operations count. Boom. And that's all she wrote, y'all. Let's give it a run, make sure it runs correctly before we submit it. Let's see, it's accepted. So let's go ahead and submit it. Make sure it's still accepted after we submit it. And look at that, y'all. 0 milliseconds beats 100% of users. That's what I'm talking about. That's what I'd like to see. So before we go, make sure you get one more look at the code. This is the whole code right here. This is like the top of the class, and then this is the rest of it. And y'all, with that being said, I hope y'all learned something today, and I hope to see y'all here tomorrow for another day, another LeetCode problem. See y'all then.